The screen flickers, and a teenage boy stands frozen in a grainy public service video. A soft voice warns him about the dangers of gangs. Then, without reason or mercy, a dead body snaps upright like a creature pulled from a cheap horror movie. For a moment, you don't know whether to laugh or to worry. But you do know this: when a message meant to protect our kids looks more like a zombie jump scare, something in our system has drifted far from reality. Because out here, in real neighborhoods, life doesn't work like that. No red sirens. No dramatic music. Sometimes it's just a hat, a hoodie, or the colors someone wears. Sometimes it's a boy waiting for work outside a Home Depot. Sometimes it's a student doodling the mascot of his school. And yet those tiny, ordinary things can end up defining a person in the eyes of the police, turning them from a neighbor into a known gang member with a single click in a hidden database. So here is the question that should trouble every parent and grandparent watching. If something this small can change a young person's future, what else in their world is at risk of being misunderstood? It didn't begin with databases or color-coded threat levels. It began much earlier, in neighborhoods where fear traveled faster than trust, and where the word gang drifted through conversations like smoke, thick, unsettling, and hard to define. For decades, cities across America tried to contain that fear with tougher laws, louder warnings, and longer shadows cast over communities of color. And out of that fear came an idea that seemed simple enough at first: if police could keep a list, a quiet, internal list, of people who might be in gangs, maybe they could stop violence before it reached someone's front porch. That list would eventually be called a gang database, though it wasn't always digital. In its earliest form, it was a feeling, a hunch, a neighborhood rumor translated into paperwork. Officers wrote down names based on who stood where, who wore what, and who walked home with whom. None of this was built on science. It was built on instinct, the kind that can be right sometimes, but terribly wrong when it grows out of fear rather than understanding. As technology advanced, those instincts found a new home inside computer systems that promised accuracy, efficiency, and control. A label entered into a screen became intelligence. A note written on a form became evidence. And slowly, these lists, once imagined as tools, turned into something far more powerful: quiet judges of who belonged and who didn't. To understand how they spiraled so far off course, you have to picture the communities where they landed hardest. Picture a teenager, maybe fresh from Central America, stepping into a new life in the United States. He doesn't know the language well yet. He doesn't know the rules beneath the rules, those invisible expectations about how to dress, how to move, how to avoid being misunderstood. He only knows that back home, survival meant blending in. So he buys the same baseball cap he sees older boys wearing. He draws the same mascot he sees on the school gym wall. He writes the same 3 numbers, 503 or 504, that remind him of the place his mother still calls home. But in the eyes of the system being built, each of those tiny, innocent choices could mean something else. This is where the story of gang databases truly begins, not in a conference room where the technology was designed, but in the quiet moments when ordinary objects became suspicious. A red hoodie. A bull's cap. A blue pair of sneakers. Even the colors of a country's flag displayed proudly on a holiday could be reinterpreted as a warning sign. Police departments across the U.S. believed they were building a protective shield. Something to stay ahead of violence. Something to help them understand the streets. But as the rules expanded, their definitions stretched thinner and thinner. Terms like association, known location, and paraphernalia became broad enough to catch almost anyone living in the wrong place at the wrong time. And in immigrant communities, especially Latino neighborhoods shaped by generations of resilience and struggle, that net grew even wider. People arriving in America carried pieces of home with them, numbers from their country codes, flags from their independence days, drawings of local icons. But those cultural markers collided with a system searching for patterns, hungry for certainty, and far too ready to assume the worst. This early phase of gang databases was shaped by a troubling belief that danger could be predicted simply by looking at someone. Not by what they had done, but by what they wore, where they stood, or who happened to walk beside them. And once a name entered those systems, it rarely left. A single moment, a quick stop by police, a snapshot with friends, a note made at a school, could follow a person for years, resurfacing in a courtroom, an IC detention center, or a routine traffic stop where an officer glanced at a screen and saw the words, "security risk." That is the true, origin story of gang databases. They were not born from fact, but from fear. Not from precision, but from assumptions. And as time passed, those assumptions hardened into something communities could feel instantly but rarely challenge, a silent system that claimed to know who they were before they had the chance to speak for themselves. For many Americans, especially older Black viewers who have watched entire generations navigate biased policing, this story feels painfully familiar. It echoes stop and frisk. It echoes redlining. It echoes every moment when the country promised safety but delivered scrutiny instead. Gang databases may have been new, but the forces that shaped them were old, deeply rooted, and already woven into the lived experience of millions. And that is why understanding where these databases came from matters. Because once we see their beginnings, not as neutral tools but as fragile structures built on shaky ground, we can begin to understand how they grew so large, so flawed, and so dangerous to the very people they were supposed to protect. There came a point when gang databases stopped being quiet experiments and started becoming something much bigger, an authority unto themselves. As fear around gangs grew, these systems expanded, swallowing entire neighborhoods, entire schools, entire generations into categories that seemed to grow broader with every passing year. And the most unsettling part wasn't how quickly they grew, but how confidently they claimed to know who was dangerous and who wasn't. Their rise can be seen most clearly in the places where their logic was stretched to its limits. In Boston, for example, the police built a point system that looked scientific on the surface: numbers, thresholds, neat little categories. 6 points made you a gang associate. 10 points made you a verified gang member. But the inputs looked less like criminal behavior and more like the ordinary rhythms of life. 2 points for standing in a group photo. 4 points for wearing something that someone, somewhere, once decided might resemble gang identifiers. The kind of rules that made a kid's yearbook picture as risky as a crime scene. And it wasn't just Boston. In New York, the list of gang colors grew so large it nearly swallowed the entire rainbow. Black, white, gray, red, green, blue, brown, khaki, orange, even lime green. Ordinary clothes became coded warnings. A grandmother watching from a living room couch might imagine her grandkids in jeans and hoodies, not realizing that to the wrong officer, those colors could raise a quiet red flag no one ever tells them about. As the logic expanded, the net widened. Location became suspicion. Public housing buildings were labeled gang-associated, turning entire communities into supposed hubs of crime with a single keystroke. A park in south-central LA, where families picnicked, kids practiced dance moves, and neighbors shared cold drinks on hot afternoons, was suddenly labeled a gang zone. And the people inside it became suspects by proximity. That was where Larry Sanders, LV, the voice behind Gangsta's Paradise, found himself one day. He wasn't doing anything but enjoying the afternoon when officers jumped out, asking for ID and demanding to see tattoos. A week later, a letter arrived. He was officially labeled a gang member. Not because of violence, not because of crime, but because he happened to stand in a place the police had decided was gang territory, and because he had tattoos, like millions of other Americans. The irony cut deep. He wasn't just not a gang member, he was someone who spent his life pulling kids away from gang life. He mentored, he mediated, he talked young people off the edge when the world around them was pushing them toward trouble. And yet, the system that should have recognized his work instead stamped him with a label he had fought so hard to keep others from wearing. This was the height of the gang database era, when a label held more weight than a life story, and when flawed information could travel farther than truth. Reporters discovered that in Texas, a man named Francisco Garcia Casique had been listed in a gang database not only without evidence, but with the wrong photo entirely. And only when journalists pointed it out did the entry quietly disappear. No apology. No explanation. In Washington, D.C., nearly half of the names vanished from the city's database once lawsuits and media attention forced officials to examine what they had created. A police lieutenant warned his team in an internal email that the unit would get burned if they didn't tighten up their so-called validations. It wasn't a system correcting itself, it was a system getting caught. Even protests became targets. In Phoenix, a group of demonstrators, most of them young, many of them black or Latino, carried umbrellas, wore black, and chanted against police brutality. For that, they were branded a criminal street gang named the Cab and described as more dangerous than the Crips, the Bloods, and the Hells Angels. Some of them didn't even know one another. One wasn't even part of the protest, he had just stopped to take photos. And yet, authorities tried to fold them into a narrative that had nothing to do with who they were. Schools were no safer from this wave of mislabeling. In Long Island, where fear of MS-13 ran high, students were told that a bull's cap, a bandana, or even the numbers 503 or 504 might indicate gang ties. One teacher recalled stopping a security guard from reporting students who wore the Salvadoran flag, because it was their Independence Day. To the guard, it looked like gang symbolism. To the kids, it was pride in their heritage. And then there was Alex, a Honduran teenager whose story captured everything broken about these systems. His blue sneakers, innocent to him, were flagged as gang colors. The number 504 on his backpack, his country code, was marked as evidence. A doodle of a horned mascot, his school's official logo, became another red flag. Within months, he was on a gang database. Shortly after, ICE came to his home. The label followed him more aggressively than any truth ever could. This was the height of gang databases, a time when suspicion was automated, when culture was mistaken for crime, when childhood was reinterpreted as evidence. A time when the system believed it could predict danger by scanning clothes, colors, friendships, or neighborhood boundaries, never pausing to ask whether the tools were measuring anything real at all. And it is here, at the top of their power, that the cracks finally began to show. For every system built on shaky assumptions, there comes a moment when the truth pushes back, slowly at first, then all at once. With gang databases, that moment arrived when real lives began colliding with false labels in ways the public could no longer ignore. The cracks were always there, but now they were widening, revealing just how fragile and dangerous these systems had become. The first tremors came from the courts. In the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, 2 federal judges examined the so-called evidence of his MS-13 membership and found it thinner than paper left out in the rain. One judge wrote that declaring Abrego a gang member would border on fanciful. That was a rare acknowledgement from the legal system. The gang database wasn't just flawed, it was inventing realities, and people were paying the price. But Abrego was far from the only one. In Texas, the state's own gang database listed a Venezuelan man, Francisco Garcia Casique, as a member of Tren de Aragua. The proof? A photo that wasn't even him. Reporters uncovered the mistake: 2 different faces, 2 different men, 2 different lives. Only then did officials quietly delete his name. Imagine a system so careless that it can confuse 2 strangers and still claim to protect the public. These weren't small clerical errors. They were signals of a system stretched past its limits, where suspicion had become default and accuracy an afterthought. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., investigative reporting and lawsuits forced the police department to take a hard look at its own gang database. Nearly half the names vanished almost overnight. Think about that. If half a list can disappear as soon as someone starts asking questions, what does that say about the strength of the evidence that put those names there in the first place? A police lieutenant had warned his team earlier about weak and bad validations, saying the unit would get burned eventually. And now, the flames were rising. The same pattern surfaced in California. By law, police were supposed to re-evaluate gang database entries every 5 years, removing those no longer relevant or unsupported. But when the first in-depth audit came, it revealed names that should have been purged long ago: men who had moved away, kids who had grown up and changed course, people who had never belonged there to begin with. The database wasn't updating, it was calcifying. For many, the damage appeared years later, long after they believed their past was behind them. Victor Dempsey, once involved in a gang as a teenager, left that life more than a decade ago. He rebuilt. He worked. He moved forward. But during a routine traffic stop, the officer's screen lit up with a mugshot from his youth and a label that read, "Security Risk." Dempsey had no idea he was still on the database, until he caught a glimpse of the monitor. One look. One word. That was all it took to remind him that the system had never truly let him go. This is what decay looks like in a system that pretends to know people better than they know themselves. It's not dramatic. It doesn't shout. It creeps. One mislabeled name. One outdated file. One profile built on the wrong photo. And each mistake lands hardest on the same communities: Black families, Latino immigrants, young people navigating a world that often misunderstands the symbols of their culture. Then came the moment that revealed just how far the logic had drifted: the Phoenix arrests. 17 protesters, many simply wearing black, some carrying umbrellas, one just taking photos, were charged as a criminal street gang called the Cab. A police sergeant even told a grand jury they were more dangerous than the Crips, the Bloods, and the Hells Angels. It was an accusation disconnected from reality, a reflection of frustration and hostility rather than fact. And yet, for a brief moment, the system nearly made it official. When a tool designed to track violent groups can be turned against peaceful protesters, or teenagers at school, or musicians doing community work, the problem is no longer technical, it's moral. The collapse of trust didn't happen in a single moment. It accumulated slowly, like dust settling on an old shelf. People discovered they were on lists they'd never heard of. Families were separated because a number or a doodle or a pair of shoes was misread as evidence. Children were deported based on criteria that wouldn't hold up under even basic scrutiny. And yet, even as the failures stacked up, many departments kept adding names. The opacity remained. The consequences deepened. And the communities affected, already carrying generations of suspicion and surveillance, found themselves once again navigating a system that saw danger where there was none. This was the turning point. Not the end of gang databases, but the moment the country started seeing them for what they truly were: not tools of precision, but instruments that cracked under their own weight, harming the very people they claimed to protect. The fall had begun. And soon, the nation would have to ask whether something so broken could ever be fixed, or whether the only solution was to let it go. From a distance, gang databases might look like a local issue, something playing out in individual neighborhoods, handled by individual police departments. But once you step back, you see a much larger picture, one that stretches across the country and beyond its borders. And in that wider frame, the consequences become even harder to ignore. Across the United States, communities of color, Black families in major cities, Central American immigrants on Long Island, Latino neighborhoods in the Southwest, felt the weight of these labels long before the rest of the country fully understood what was happening. To them, the idea of being misread wasn't hypothetical. It was lived experience. They knew how quickly an assumption could become a threat, how a simple misunderstanding could open the door to deeper surveillance, harsher policing, or sudden encounters with immigration authorities. What made gang databases uniquely dangerous was how easily their labels crossed legal boundaries. A person marked as a gang member didn't just face greater police scrutiny at home. That label could follow them into immigration court, into detention centers, even across national borders. It could decide whether someone stayed with their family or was sent to a country they barely remembered. In cases like Francisco Garcia Casique or the teenager Alex, the label didn't just alter a police report, it altered the entire trajectory of their lives. To the world watching, this raised uncomfortable questions about American justice. How could a country that prides itself on due process maintain a system where children were deported because of doodles, colors, or country codes? How could a nation that speaks of fairness allow a database, unknown to the public and unquestioned by most courts, to play such a powerful role in shaping the futures of immigrants and young people of color? Even within the U.S., the debate deepened. Some cities, like Chicago and Portland, scrapped their databases entirely, and the feared crime waves never came. Others insisted they had tightened their criteria, though community members had little way to verify those claims. Trust, once broken, wasn't so easily repaired. And so the conversation began shifting, from whether these databases were flawed to whether they were ever truly necessary. Experts reminded the nation that real safety comes from presence, mentorship, and community intervention, not from a list that treats culture as crime and childhood as evidence. In the end, the question wasn't just about policing. It was about identity, dignity, and who gets the benefit of understanding in a country still struggling to see all its people clearly. In the end, the story of gang databases is not a story about numbers or software. It is a story about people, kids trying to fit in, workers searching for a day's pay, families carrying their culture through unfamiliar streets. It is a story about how quickly a label, once printed quietly into a police system, can echo loudly through someone's entire life. And when those labels are built on shaky assumptions, the harm doesn't stay contained. It spreads, to neighborhoods, to schools, to immigration courts, to the very idea of justice itself. The truth is simple: a database cannot know a person's heart. It cannot understand pride in a flag, affection for a hometown area code, or the innocence behind a student's doodle of a school mascot. It cannot hear the fear in a parent's voice or see the hope in a young person's eyes. And yet for years, these lists pretended to speak with certainty about who was dangerous and who was not. They decided futures with the cold logic of a checkbox. But something powerful happens when people begin to question the systems around them. Chicago and Portland showed that deleting these databases doesn't make communities less safe. If anything, it clears the path for real solutions: neighbors guiding young people, intervention workers stepping into conflicts before they ignite, families being treated as human beings instead of entries in a file. That's why the final image of this story matters so deeply. LV, once labeled a gang member simply for being present in the wrong park, once mistaken for the very thing he worked to prevent, standing on stage, singing the words that have carried decades of truth, that the ones we hurt are you and me. It is a reminder that every mistaken label has a human cost, and every life misjudged is a loss shared by all of us. So here is the question to carry forward. If we know these databases harm far more than they help, what kind of safety do we want for the next generation, and who do we trust to define it? If this story made you think about your children or grandchildren, share it. If it reminded you of someone who was judged too quickly, say their name in the comments. We read every one. And if you want more stories that look past the labels and toward the people living behind them, stay with us. There's more to come. Until next time, keep their story alive.